our keynote speaker, Dr. Robert M. Stonehill. Dr. Stonehill is the Managing Director of the Education Program at ARR. He is in his current role and in his previous role as Chief Program Officer at Learning Point Associates. Dr. Stonehill is responsible for developing and oversight of a range of projects to support effective implementation and outcomes of educational policies, programs, and initiatives at the national, state, and local level. He provides guidance in developing, managing, and evaluating national education initiatives to support improved teaching and learning in high-need schools and communities, and is a nationally recognized expert in designing, implementing, and evaluating after-school and expanded learning enrichment programs. He also serves as senior advisor in designing, implementing, and evaluating national, state, and local initiatives to address the challenge of providing highly qualified and effective teachers, particularly in STEM subject areas, and to establish performance-based compensation systems for educators. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Stonehill.
Thank you, Sina. Thanks for having me here today. So Monica and I kind of divided up the world this afternoon, where I'm going to concentrate more on the idea of effectiveness and the measures of effectiveness and where the field is in terms of putting those measures and those systems in place. And Monica then is going to get to talk a lot more about the equitable access initiative itself and how that's playing out. So we've already pretty much talked about everything that I had prepared, which is good. It gives me a very efficient approach to just blow through everything really quickly as kind of a reminder, and at some points I think a trigger for a deeper conversation about where we are as a country, where we are as individual states, and at some point where the districts and the schools are going to need to go. So let me go through this whole history a little bit and introduction a little bit and remind people exactly what brought us around this time. And the precipitating factor was the Department of Education's shout outs to all of the state educational agencies, the SCAs, asking them to prepare a plan to talk about the distribution of unqualified, inexperienced, and out-of-field teachers. And in a minute, I will get a little deeper into why those terms are being used. So the states have to come up with this plan to talk about whether there is inequity in how those three categories of teachers are distributed across the state. But then the state has to go a little bit further and say what it's going to do about it. And we all know, and we've already talked about, the states having somewhat limited authority in doing anything directly about it, but certainly can play a role in establishing policies and supports and TA, and probably more importantly than all of that, really good data about where the most experienced, the most effective teachers are and where they are not. So we know the plans are due June 1st, and we know that the Indiana team is pulling their all-nighters and making lots of phone calls to other states to get a sense of where they are. And there is, of course, quite a few groups that have been contributing. And I have to say that in the last 2 months, this has kind of become the all-consuming mission at work, working around the equitable access work. And it's been really fantastic, actually, to do. So Monica will talk about the EASN a bit. The Equity Assistance Centers are a part of that, as is the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, as is the Midwest Comprehensive Center, the Great Lakes Comprehensive Center. Council of Chief State School Officers has also been a critical partner in this, and then there's other groups, public impact, not listed here. So it's really been a a multiple organizational approach to creating resources and assets for people. As you know, we talked about it a little bit. States did work similar to this 9 years ago. They had to create the first equity plan, AKA the HQT plan, and every state submitted in spring of 2006 a plan to look at highly qualified teachers. Just really explicitly, that was what was on the table at the time. What did the distribution of highly qualified teachers look like in each state? When the plans came in, the Department of Ed pulled together peer review panels and looked at all of those plans, read them, rated them, gave feedback. The states had a chance to fix them up. They were all then made public, and there were about 5 or 6 states that just really did just a terrible job. And we just kept working with those states individually until their plans were kind of acceptable. Interestingly, one of the things we're learning as we look at the data now across states, and we've heard it already from the Indiana team, highly qualified teaching is no longer a differentiator. It's 99+% of teachers are highly qualified. The few exceptions, there are 2 exceptions. One was mentioned earlier, the one-off course that somebody is teaching that they may not have an endorsement for, but they're highly qualified for all their other courses. And the place where this plays out more is in the rural communities. So in the K-12 schools and the one-room schoolhouse districts, there is a lot of teaching burden on individual teachers to teach 4, 5, 6 different courses, and they are both out of field and, by the same definition, not necessarily highly qualified. In some states, what we're finding is that this analysis just takes them right back to their traditional problems of dealing with rural and isolated schools and rural and isolated communities. So it's a new lens that kind of energizes very traditional challenges there. So HQT largely we will see is more or less off the table. So we could say, I guess, that was a win for us, because 9 years ago there were a lot of teachers who were not highly qualified, and the states really did double down and put in place measures by which we could ascertain that teachers really knew the subjects that they were teaching. So maybe that did prove to be an incremental investment overall in teacher preparation and teacher preparedness for each course they taught. I'm going to skip through this a little bit. I was going to put in a plug for the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, which is one of the cornerstones organizations providing support for this work, and mention that there are quite a few resources available. I know the Indiana DOE has taken full use of the support from GTL Center and the Equitable Access to Excellent Educators work. So this is the challenge before us. Monica is going to get into the more details about this, but every state plan now, not talking about HQT at all, back to unqualified, unqualified, out of field, and inexperienced teachers. Those are the legal terms that have to be addressed in the plans, and the plans have to do 6 things. They have to engage stakeholders, they have to look at the data and find where the equity gaps are, they have to define the terms that they are going to use. For instance, if you do get into where are effective educators or ineffective educators distributed or experienced, you have to define all of those terms. And then the fun part, root cause analysis. Why do you think these gaps are there? What is really accounting for those gaps? And as you figure out what accounts for them, the next step then is to say, well, what can we do about it? What strategies emerge? Finally, the last two things that the state plans have to include is a discussion of how progress is going to be monitored so that you'll know whether things are moving in the right direction. And then finally, public reporting on how things are moving. So Monica's going to get more into some of the details about this. Any questions so far? So why inexperienced, unqualified, or out of teachers? Why are we starting with a focus on those three terms? And there are a couple reasons. One, the obvious one, is those words are in the statute. And because the Department of Ed is relying completely on statutory language to support this requirement, those become the central terms that they are able to use without doing any rulemaking. So it's a convenient way of proceeding. If you look back, though, almost 15 years now, when ESEA was amended by No Child Left Behind, highly qualified teachers works well in a complementary way with inexperienced, unqualified, and out of field. So now there's really two types of data. How many teachers are highly qualified? Now that we know that, how are the teachers at the margins, the first-year teachers, the second-year teachers, out-of-field teachers, where do they play into this distribution? And I think in everyone's heads, these measures become the best proxy we have so far for a measure of effectiveness. And there are pretty good correlations in the research between the effectiveness of a first-year teacher versus third year and more experience. So they do become at least loose proxies for the question of effectiveness. But as far as effectiveness themselves, nobody had anything like that data back in 2002 when this law was first being put in place. Now it's different. The Department of Ed cannot say, tell us about the distribution of effective teachers, because the statute doesn't have those words in it. But when you sit down with your stakeholders, when you sit down with your colleagues, the word on everyone's tongue is really effectiveness. Where are the most effective teachers in my state? Where are the most effective teachers in my district? Where are the most effective teachers within my school? You can have amazing inequity within a school building. Think of a big high school with all the experienced teachers teaching the AP courses and all the first-year teachers, teaching everything else. So, however, in moving forward, the new drafts of the ESEA, the Senate help version in particular, which was passed in full committee in the Senate, now starts to use not just the word ineffective. I actually did modify this slide a little bit, just not on this version, but both the terms effective and ineffective are now being used in statute going forward. So this is a good warm-up act for getting ready for when you're really going to have to report on the distributions of effective teachers within the state and within the districts. So what progress have we made in identifying which teachers are effective? And I know you all have a lot to say about this because you've all said a lot about it already. You may know about this study. It was quite influential, called the Widget Effect. And it was put out in 2009 by what then was the New Teacher Project, and now has been reduced to just an abbreviation, TNTP. Basically, they said every teacher in the country is effective, qualified, satisfactory, whatever label you want to give them. Everybody is good. We don't have bad teachers. We have less than 1% of teachers to worry about or deal with. And then they got a little bit into an explanation of why this is. All teachers are either good or great. This is the old rating systems. Principal drops in once a year, says everything's going great, congratulations. Professional development, as a result, is really not tied to anything substantial. The teachers were not getting feedback. Nobody was watching them. Nobody was giving them pointers. It was all just a culture of everything is fine. And that has some consequences. As a novice teacher, well, everything is fine with them too. So they were not really getting very strong induction programs. They were not being assigned mentors. It was just easy to ignore the work that had to be done in building up the core, particularly the core of new teachers. By the way, just a little factoid, as of about 3 years ago, the modal years of experience for teachers, that is, what years worth of experience did the most teachers in the country have? The answer up to about 3 years ago was 0. There were more first-year teachers than there were teachers with any other level of experience level. Now, in the last 3 years, that's changed a little bit. Now the modal number is more like 2 or 3. But as of a few years ago, in the middle of the recession, new teachers accounted for the greatest number of any experience level. And then the bottom line, if none of these systems are in place, if no one is really being attentive, then how do you help somebody? You know, where do you even begin to supporting the teachers in the way they need support? The Widget Effect was really pretty influential, and one of the groups influenced by them was the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation, since 2009, has been investing very heavily in a project called Measures of Effective Teaching. And they worked in districts across the country with hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers, and then did really what were called deep dives in 4 districts in the country, Memphis and Hillsborough, New York City, and Denver, where they spent hours and hours using video, recording teachers teaching, getting feedback, calibrating how teachers rated their peers on watching the videos. They really wanted to understand what effective teaching looked like, how you measure it, and how you support it. So they came up with a couple of findings and recommendations based on the MET study, as it's called. First of all, multiple measures. The big finding is you absolutely need multiple measures in order to make any kind of judgments whatsoever about the relative effectiveness of a given teacher. They also went on to say that school leaders can do a better job tailoring professional development, giving feedback to the teachers based on what they're seeing. And now in nearly every state that I'm familiar with where they are starting to go to scale with their educator evaluation systems, giving feedback on a regular basis has become the most important cornerstone of their approach. They are really working to make the educator evaluation systems, the teacher evaluation systems, legitimate supporters of better practice and tying it in real time to conversations that the school leaders, could be the principal, but it also could be peers or teacher mentors, teacher leaders, to help the youngest teachers particularly succeed. So the first 2 of these we've already talked about at some length today. This is now what you know to be the typical foundations of a teacher evaluation system, a teacher support system in nearly every state, 44 states plus even all the other states are doing this. So we talked about observations of professional practice. I'll cycle back through that again quickly. We've talked about student growth measures. I'll talk about that quickly as well. And then I want to introduce some emerging metrics. People are starting to play around with some other ways of contributing to that multi-measure approach to this. So we know, Dr. Murphy was talking about this earlier, people are using rubrics. The rubrics are actually pretty good. Teachers are getting a lot of feedback, which they never got before. Teachers who are in their first few years of teaching tend to get observed more often than experienced teachers do, and this is to everyone's satisfaction. the weighting is shifting. If you've been following what's going on in a lot of legislatures, a lot of states, where legislatures initially were saying we want 50% of a teacher's evaluation to be based on student achievement growth, they're now dialing it back quite a bit. So New York just dialed it back, for instance, to 33%. And we're going to, I think, see that in a lot more places. The legislation and the waivers and the race to the top requirements did not require any particular weight. They just said it should be significant. So significant was 20% to somebody and 50% to somebody else. So what are some challenges? We talked about some of these earlier, but not these two challenges. One is we are starting to see data that suggests that for teachers of high poverty classrooms or less advanced academic classrooms, that there's less engagement. The students sit there basically, they don't necessarily have a lot to say, and no matter how the teacher tries to tease out engagement and interaction, classrooms tend to be less energized than where higher academic students are, where they're asking questions and they're raising their hand. And so that has an effect on the teacher observation ratings, because student engagement and questioning and feedback and understanding and explaining for clarity is easier in some classes than it is in other classes. And we think this may be a bit of an issue in biasing results downward a little bit. And then the whole new question, well, do these observation ratings, does Marzano, does Danielson, does Strong, do any of these really look for teacher behaviors that are now aligned with how the Common Core, I shouldn't use those words here, the Indiana standards, the new Indiana standards for teaching and learning. Do these observations really get at the questioning for clarity, the explaining, the finding multiple answers to a question? We think they are not quite there yet, and I understand that Charlotte Danielson is actually working to refresh her rubric a little bit with more of an eye on what we expect 21st century skills and kind of a new pedagogy to look like. So stay tuned on that one. Student growth measures, we also talked about those. We know the pluses and minuses of value-added measures, of growth measures, student growth measures. They're similar but a little different, technically in how they're calculated. They're both normative measures that essentially rank the teachers in your sample from those who moved their group more than predicted to those who moved their group less than predicted. And this is an area that AIR has done a ton of work around. We actually do believe that value-added measures, that student growth measures, can do a pretty good job, certainly a good job at really identifying the highest performing teachers from the very lowest performing teachers. It's a bit of a muddle in the middle where the standard errors really get big. But if you start collecting this data 2 years in a row, 3 years in a row, you bring in all of the explanatory variables as covariates and predictors, the measures start to really line up, and they correlate with the observation measures in the best cases. There's about a 0.4 correlation. So there really is a relationship that we can see between good value-added scores and between teacher observation scores. And here, these are counting less. The pressure is on for the student growth measures to be, as I said, dialed back a little bit in terms of their weighting. So what are the issues we're still wrestling with around value-added measures? First of all, they really should be done on large data sets. If you try to put together student growth measures or value-added measures, let's say in a small school district, you're pitting your teachers against one another. If you do it for the whole state, you're not. You're really establishing baselines of performance where teachers in a school or a community, in a district, are really measuring themselves against the performance of the whole state and not pitting themselves against one another. So that's kind of a critical factor. How are all of these going to be affected by PARC or by Smarter Balanced with the new, far more rigorous performance assessments? We think that actually value-added calculations or student growth calculations will not be affected very much because they're normative distributions. You're always going to have your highest teachers, you're always going to have your lowest teachers. It doesn't matter if the test is harder. It may not change that ranking. What will change, though, are the proficiency rates. So, for instance, I said earlier, we saw in New York State, they went to the next gen test and proficiency rates dropped by more than 20%. So,
Can I just add one thing? So
yeah, sure.
that's specific to, well, not specific to Indiana, I guess, but maybe. So we do use, well, many of our districts use the state accountability model, which is primarily based on proficiency as part of their teacher evaluation data as well. So particularly for those that don't have the individual growth measures from state assessed areas, but also teachers that do, they often use that school-wide accountability measure. That said, we are not pausing accountability.
you're not what?
You're not pausing accountability.
Yes.
So it's also something that just,
Yes, but this is an issue around the country where states are getting kind of a free year or 2 years to phase in the new tests, to see how they work, to pilot them, to not have high stakes. And in some cases, it means not even publicly really reporting broadly on the results of those tests. So some places are taking a timeout, some places are piloting, some places are moving forward cautiously, some places are completely unaffected by the changes. And we have seen so much development of measures to be used in the non-traditionally tested grades and subjects. So I mentioned student learning objectives, student growth measures, whether they're teacher-made or district-developed. There's a huge investment around the country in end-of-course exams to measure particular subjects that are not tested at the state level. There's a lot of use of off-the-shelf, commercially available tests for those purposes as well. So all of this is shaking out. And then if you can't do any of that, the other solution, which is quite controversial, is rostering your art teachers to their students' English scores, their ELA scores, because teaching English is supposed to be part of their mission. So that part of it is still controversial, but at least provides a technical way out. Then the last thing on this list, increasingly, is an issue, and it's really set this whole field back in some places. What is a protected record and what is an open record that's subject to Freedom of Information Act? When the Los Angeles Times published the value-added score of every single teacher in LA Unified, it really set everyone back a lot. Those scores were just not ready for that kind of scrutiny. There were a lot of really bad consequences as a result of that. On the other hand, if there are public records, you can't protect them. So everyone's defining public record in a different way and trying to do it in a way that does protect the privacy of the teachers. But then you have public interest groups that say, no, I want to know who's effective and not effective. I don't want my kid assigned to a badly rated teacher that's been ineffective for the last 3 years. I want to see that my kids are being assigned to effective teachers. So here are some ideas of where the field is going a little bit. Now that we've experimented, now that we're settling down a little bit in how we use student growth models and how we use observation and feedback, what are some other things people are beginning to try? So I've listed 6 different things we're seeing more of. One is student level portfolios as a measure of student growth. Here's where they started at the beginning of the year. here are all the sources of evidence they added, here is how they wrote up things, and here's what the portfolio looks like at the end. And we've created a metric by which we're able to measure student growth on this portfolio. That becomes a measure of student growth. Similarly, how do teachers' artifacts evolve over the course of time? What does a lesson plan look like when they start in their first week of school? And what kind of preparation are they? And what does their lesson planning, their curriculum, their approaches look like by the last week of school? So in the same way that we're developing student-level portfolios, people are starting to look at how the teachers practice and the written products and the developed products that they use to guide their instruction, how are those evolving through the course of the year. Increasingly, we're hearing about the use of school climate measures, conditions for learning, conditions for teaching measures, tripod surveys, family feedback, student feedback, as ways both of measuring leadership in the school and to a lesser extent, measuring teacher effectiveness in the school. Advancement in professional development that's related to your job, national board certification. Attaining those things is sometimes also on the checklist for states and districts in terms of measuring effectiveness. There continues to be research that does suggest that going through advanced certification training, like national board training, actually is correlated with a higher caliber of teaching. Not necessarily a causal relationship, but at least a correlational one. And then measures of contribution, teachers who help create new curriculum units, new training, mentor roles, peer review roles, and so on. All of that can also be considered as factors in measuring teacher effectiveness. So how do we support all teachers to keep improving? We talked earlier about recruitment, we talked about induction, we talked about mentoring, we talked about career advancement opportunities. Increasingly, states and districts are starting to see this work through the lens of a human capital management system. If any of you have watched or participated, for instance, in the last competition through the Teacher Incentive Fund, the establishment of a human capital management system was at the heart of what those grants required. I know Fort Wayne has a TIF grant, and this is work that they've been attempting to do as well. And then ultimately what you really want to have is an integrated system of support, a human capital management system, a talent development framework, and you can see here there's a series of strategies and infrastructures around how do I attract teachers, how do I prepare teachers, how do I develop, support, and retain them. And to link back to what the Equitable Access Plan suggests that we not do, which is just think about reassigning effective teachers to the high-need schools. Really the challenge becomes how do I stabilize workforce in these schools? How do I keep my experienced teachers? How do I develop teacher leaders? How do I attract people to the school because it's no longer a horrible place to work, to put it bluntly? We hope that will matter in the long run. And we know that the idea of stabilizing, enhancing the quality of the workforce in a very high need, very high poverty school is a challenge, not just even when you make it a better place, because in our profession, teachers by policy are allowed to leave. They are allowed to apply for jobs in other schools. They are allowed to go to the suburban district after doing a number of years in the inner city district. It is not going to change. Those policies are not going to change. So how do we minimize a negative impact that those policies might have on the struggling schools is really the question going forward. I think at some point we're going to have to recognize there is going to be an inherent amount of inequity that is the product of the policies of our system. Nobody's changing those policies. Maybe it's a good idea not to change them because teachers do have the freedom and the flexibility to go for a higher paying job or go for a less stressful job if that's their choice. So I almost want to end with some data, a story, a good story and a bad story. So the bad story is the finding. This just came out a couple of weeks ago from Chalkboard, New York. Chalkboard. No, not Chalkbeat. Chalkbeat, New York. I do have the reference there. They have effectiveness data in New York City. They've had it for a number of years. And somebody has now gone in, the state agency has analyzed it, and they are saying if you are in a high need, high poverty school, the overwhelming tendency is you're going to have less effective teachers overall. And in the worst schools, the renewal schools, which are 60 some odd schools that are the focus of a lot of attention now, twice as many teachers were rated ineffective and developing as the city average. Ineffective and developing, I think, are code words for inexperienced. Because more inexperienced teachers get those ratings than experienced teachers by far. Now the good news, the data is going to nudge districts to revamp their placement policies with a greater focus on recruiting and retaining top teachers in the most challenging schools. So here is an example where the equity gap has been identified, and the hope is now that we see it, we're gonna do something about it. What that is to be TBD. And then a last thought. We have been working for the last couple of years with a national network of national and state teachers of the year, which gives us phenomenal access into probing with the nation's best teachers, or arguably among representatives of the best teachers in the country. What made a difference to you? Why did you become as good a teacher as you became? And they overwhelmingly say there are two factors that have helped them really, really advance in their career. And one is professional development that evolves as they evolved in their career. As novice teachers, having access to mentors is critical. But now, when you become an experienced teacher, what you really want is a set of peers in which you could share your experiences, bounce ideas off. You don't want a mentor anymore. You want a learning community that you can work together with. And as you become really experienced, the thing that they almost universally said helped them the most was the opportunity to teach. In particular, to go to colleges and universities and to teach in teacher prep programs where they are absolutely connected and they have great credibility and validity because they are still frontline classroom teachers whom the undergraduates or the graduate students really respect as knowing what they're talking about. So that's my, I don't know if there was anything new there or not. It was pretty much what we had talked about before. I hope I put it through a little bit of a prism in where we were and where we are now and where we're going. So, questions? Nope. Monica, you want to jump on?
Do you want me to go now? Or do you want to do it now?
I think what we would do now is transition to the panel.